the individual and the absolute. The first mantra of the Mandukya Upanishad describes the nature of Omkara and its connotation in relation to the whole universe. Now, it also denotes some object, as was pointed out earlier. It is a universal name which refers to a universal form in such a manner that the name and the form coalesce to constitute one being. As the name is universal and the form also is universal, they have naturally to blend into a single existence, because we cannot have two universals standing apart from each other. There is, therefore, the universal name coalescing with the universal form, Ene with Macron, Eme with Macron and Rpa become one in this experience whole. That experience is neither Ene with Macron, Eme with Macron nor Rpa, by itself. It is both, and yet neither. God is not merely a form denoted by a name, nor is he an object that can be described by any person. As all persons are included within the body of God, there is no naming God by any other entity outside it. Hence, in a sense, we may say that God is nameless. Who can call him by a name? Where is that person who can call him by a name? As there is, therefore, essentially, no name, in the ordinary sense of the term, that can designate God, he cannot also be regarded as a Rpa or a form which corresponds to a Ene with Macron, Eme with Macron or a name. There is an indescribable something which is designated ultimately by Omkara or Prava, and, being indescribable, it is visualized by a name that conveys the best of possible meanings. Though it may itself have no name, and it cannot also be said to have any particular form, we, as Jivas, individuals here on earth, cannot envisage it in that transcendent nature. We have to conceive it in our minds before we can contemplate or meditate upon it for the sake of realization. This meaningful and suggestive designation of that indescribable, transcendent something, is Brahman, the Absolute. Sarvam Hayatad Brahma, all this is, verily, Brahman. Thus begins the second mantra. All this creation is just the Absolute alone, is the real meaning of this statement. All that can be regarded as what you call this universe is that Brahman. Etat vaitat, this, verily, is that, and this are two terms demonstrating to separate entities, objects or things, that referring to a distant object and this to an object which is near. Now, this cannot be that, and yet the Upanishad proclaims, this verily is that, if this is that, if one thing can be another thing, then there are no two things. Where comes the necessity for these two demonstrative pronouns, this and that? By a process of definition called Bhaga Tyagalakna, characterization by division and elimination of certain properties, a reconciliation of these two suggestive terms, etat and tat, this and that is brought about. The famous example usually cited is of a person whom you might have seen in a distant place once, and whom you might now see near you in another place. Soyam Devadatta, this is that Devdatta. That person called Devdatta whom I saw in a distant place, now I see here, near me, in another place altogether. The places are different, he might have even grown in age, he might be speaking a different language now, he might not even recognize me due to lapse of time, there is distance of space and difference in time, yet I recognize that person now. This, verily, is that person, etat vaitat. The reconciliation of this and that is done not by a unity of the two meanings of the pronouns this and that, but a unity of the single object which these two pronouns designate. This and that do not represent any object. They only indicate an object. These are indicative pronouns pointing out to an object, and the unity of the object is established by discarding the connotation of that as well as of this. It does not matter if that person was somewhere else at one time and now he is in another place at another time. These distinctions make no difference to us in recognizing the person. Spatial and temporal differences are abandoned for the sake of the recognition of the unity of the person who is the same always, then, as well as now, there as well as here. This very method is employed in understanding such Upanishadic statements as Sarvam Hayatad Brahma, I am Avitmakron Tm Brahma, all this is Brahman, and this Tman, also, here you have, as it were, the quintessence of all Upanishadic teaching, the last word of the Vedanta, as you may call it, the culmination of the wisdom of the sages. This universe which appears to be proximate to our senses is that Brahman which seems to be distant or away from us, and this personality of ours which appears to be so proximate is also reconcilable with that absolute which appears to be far from your reach. And, finally, on a consideration of the fact that every individual can make a reference to oneself as this and to Brahman as that, and inasmuch as this is verily that, all this also is that. This personality, this individuality, this Jvatva, is ultimately unifiable with that absolute, which is supreme, but appears to be distant. If every individual is to make an assertion of this nature, the total becomes reconcilable with that, this is that. All becomes that, Sarvam Hayatad Brahma. How can many things be one thing, is another question. Sarvam Brahma, all is Brahman. A multitudinous variety seems to be unified with a single entity. This is intriguing because we have never seen many things being equated with one thing. Many things are many things and one thing is one thing. The manifold variety of the universe is perceived by us because of the differentiating characters of objects. What about this differentia, then? What happens to the differentia when we try to identify all things with a single reality? Here, again, we have to apply the same method of Bhagatigalakna, of shading something and taking something else, in the act of understanding. Just as you recognize a person who was there and who is now here by a method of sublimation of characters, all this manifold universe is recognized as one single being by the method of elimination of redundant characters which are not essential to the structure of the variety, which cannot be called the essence of the variety and which are only accidental to the particulars. That which is accidental is to be abandoned and that which is essential is to be taken. Brahman is essence and therefore it can be equated only with essence. The essential Brahman cannot be identified with the accidental attributes of the objects of the world. The name and the form, the structural distinctions that we observe in the things of the world are accidental in the sense that they persist only as long as there is space and time. As was pointed out in the first mantra itself, Yaknyat Triklititam Tarpiyomkara Eva, Brahman transcends the three periods of time, and therefore all space. For this reason it cannot be said to have the characters of space and time. What are the essential characters of space and time? They are distinction and formation, differentiation of one thing from another by attribute, definition, etc. Because of perception of specific characters called visehas, we begin to distinguish one set of visehas from another, calling each center or set as an individual or entity. Minus these visehas, these entities would vanish. We know water as drops. One drop is different from the other. When all the drops are one and there is no differentiating character between one drop and another, we call it the ocean. We, then, name it by a different epithet altogether. There is a merger of properties due to the overcoming of the difference of space and the barrier of time.